Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. The evening was alive with the hum of laughter and soft music. She was beside me, but her attention drifted. I watched as she scanned the room, her eyes landing on him more than once. A project manager, she'd introduced him as, and as I shook his hand, I felt an odd chill, a gut feeling that something wasn't right. He was confident, with a smile that lingered just a bit too long. She glowed when she looked at him, in a way that felt uncomfortably familiar. I tried to shake off the unease. After all, I trusted her, or so I thought. I followed her gaze more carefully throughout the night, noting every smile, every quick exchange. At one point, I saw her lean in close, whispering something that made his mouth quirk into a grin. It was a look I hadn't seen from her in ages, not directed at me. I couldn't help but feel like I was being left out of a conversation happening right in front of me. It gnawed at me, a sharp ache in my chest that I could feel with every heartbeat. "Are you okay?" someone asked. "A friend, maybe?" I nodded, smiling as though I were part of the light-hearted atmosphere around us. But my thoughts were spiraling, making connections where I'd once ignored them. Her late nights at the office, those unexplained business trips, suddenly, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too blind to see. How long had this been going on? And how had I missed it? I felt my face tighten, trying to control my expression, trying not to let the boiling anger show. I took a deep breath, refocusing on the people around me, joining in a conversation about mundane things, like favorite restaurants and movies. But all I could hear was the laughter that she shared with him, the private moments that felt like secrets being unraveled in front of me. The party eventually drew to a close, and we drove home in silence. She stared out the window, and I couldn't bring myself to say anything. Not yet. My thoughts were tangled, my emotions raw and unfiltered. I knew that if I spoke, I might not be able to control the anger, the bitterness that was rising in my throat like bile. I needed to think, to figure out what my next steps would be. Over the next few days, I took on a new role in our relationship, the quiet observer. I noticed things that had once seemed trivial, like the way she always made sure to answer her phone in another room, or how her smile seemed a bit brighter whenever she received a text. She was hiding something, and I was going to find out what. I started going through her things when she wasn't around. It was something I'd never done before. Trust had always been the cornerstone of our relationship, or so I'd thought. But as I dug deeper, I felt justified. If she had nothing to hide, then there would be nothing to find. But the more I searched, the more I uncovered small clues that led to the inescapable conclusion. Receipts for dinners she'd never mentioned, a travel itinerary that didn't match the dates she'd given me. It was like she'd left a trail of breadcrumbs, daring me to follow. Then, one night, I hit the jackpot. She'd left her phone on the kitchen counter while she took a shower, and a notification popped up, a message from Project M. I unlocked the phone, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through the messages. They were filled with flirty banter, inside jokes, and words that had once been reserved for me. I felt my chest tighten, my throat constrict as I read each line. It was all right there, every lie she'd fed me, every betrayal she'd tried to hide. I felt sick. My mind raced with possibilities: confront her, pack my bags, leave without a word. But none of those felt satisfying. She'd made a fool of me, and I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. I wanted her to feel the same pain she'd inflicted on me, to understand what it felt like to be betrayed by the person you trusted most. For the next few days, I pretended nothing had changed. I smiled, laughed at her jokes, and acted as if everything was perfect. Inside, though, I was seething. I started planning, piecing together a strategy that would ensure she couldn't simply brush this under the rug. I began by quietly taking stock of our finances, cataloging every shared asset, every investment, every cent we'd built together over the years. If she thought she could pull one over on me and walk away scot-free, she had another thing coming. I wasn't content to just hurt her financially. I wanted her to feel the sting of public humiliation, to have her friends and family see her for who she truly was. So, I started dropping hints, subtle comments here and there, things that would make people question her loyalty, her integrity. It was petty, I knew, but there was a dark satisfaction in watching her squirm, seeing the seeds of doubt take root in the minds of those who once idolized her. Finally, I invited her out to dinner. It was a place that held significance for us, a cozy restaurant where we'd celebrated anniversaries and shared countless memories. She looked surprised, maybe even touched, as I told her I wanted to spend a special evening together. But I wasn't doing this for the sake of romance. I was setting the stage for the final act, the moment when everything would come crashing down. We ordered our favorite dishes, reminisced about the early days of our relationship, and sipped wine as though we were two people deeply in love. She seemed happy, relaxed, as if nothing was amiss. And for a moment, I almost felt a pang of regret. But then I remembered the messages, the lies, the cold look she'd shared with him across that crowded room, and my resolve hardened. As we finished dessert, I looked her in the eye and told her I knew everything. Her smile faltered, the color draining from her face as she realized what was happening. I took out the folder I'd prepared, filled with screenshots, receipts, and a detailed timeline of every moment she'd betrayed me. I laid it on the table between us, watching as her hands shook, her eyes wide with shock. "You didn't think I'd find out, did you?" I said, my voice cold and measured. She tried to stammer out an excuse, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. This was my moment, and I wasn't about to let her ruin it with lies. The silence that followed was thick, filled with unspoken accusations and shattered dreams. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I felt nothing but contempt. I stood up, tossed some cash on the table, and walked out, leaving her to pick up the pieces of the life she'd so carelessly thrown away. Outside, the air was cool, refreshing. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. She had thought she could get away with it, that she could deceive me without consequence. But I'd shown her that betrayal has a price, one she'd be paying for a long time to come. The days that followed our confrontation felt surreal. There was a cold, quiet satisfaction that came with watching her unravel. The guilt that had threatened to creep in during those early moments was long gone, replaced by a focused drive to finish what I'd started. Her tears, her pleas for forgiveness, they meant nothing to me now. I could see right through her. This wasn't love, it was desperation. She knew I had the upper hand, and that terrified her. I'd already moved into the guest room, but for the sake of appearances, I stayed in the house. We had a few mutual friends who would ask questions if I suddenly vanished. Besides, I wasn't done with her yet. Every night, I watched her from across the dinner table as she picked at her food, her eyes red and swollen. She tried to start conversations, to rebuild some semblance of normalcy, but I remained stone-faced, giving her nothing to work with. This silence was part of my plan. She could stew in her guilt, letting it fester until it consumed her. On the outside, I kept up the image of the devoted husband. At work, I laughed with my colleagues, shared stories of married life, and went through the motions of a man who had everything in control. No one knew the truth, and that was exactly how I wanted it. If she thought she could keep her image intact, she was in for a rude awakening. One evening, I stayed late at the office, using the empty quiet of the building to lay out the next steps in meticulous detail. This wasn't about getting even. It was about making sure she understood that actions have consequences. I had a lawyer friend, Brad, who specialized in family law. Over lunch one day, I casually asked him about divorce proceedings, especially how assets could be divided if one party was found guilty of infidelity. Brad didn't know the real reason behind my questions, he thought it was hypothetical, a morbid curiosity perhaps. He explained that in cases of infidelity, courts often favored the betrayed spouse. If there was substantial proof, a clean division of assets could be argued, and alimony could be reduced or even dismissed. I soaked up every word, mentally cataloging it for later. When I returned home that evening, she was waiting for me in the living room. Her face was pale, her eyes haunted. I could tell she hadn't slept. I sat across from her, crossing my arms as I waited for her to speak. She took a shaky breath, running a hand through her hair. "Look, I know I made a terrible mistake," she began, her voice breaking. "I can't explain why. I was just—" "Stop," I interrupted, holding up a hand. I didn't want to hear her excuses, her half-baked attempts to justify what she'd done. "We're beyond explanations. You know what you did, and so do I. That's all that matters." She looked down, her shoulders slumping. There was a long silence, heavy and tense, before she looked up at me again. "So, what happens now?" I stared at her for a moment, relishing the fear in her eyes. "That depends. You should think very carefully about your next moves. If you want to walk away from this without losing everything, you'd better start cooperating." Her face contorted with a mix of anger and despair. "So, you're just going to take everything from me? Destroy our life over one mistake?" "One mistake?" I scoffed, the bitterness spilling out. "You don't get to call this a mistake. You lied to me, betrayed me, and laughed behind my back. This isn't just some slip-up, and you know it." She swallowed, her face going pale. I watched as she grappled with her guilt, her mouth opening and closing as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I let the silence linger, making sure she felt the full weight of her actions. The next day, I set up an appointment with Brad. I brought the evidence with me, the texts, the receipts, and everything else I'd gathered. Brad was shocked, but he didn't pry. He simply nodded, offering a sympathetic ear as I outlined my terms. I wanted the house, the savings, and full control of our investments. I wanted her to walk away with nothing but the clothes on her back, to feel the sting of loss just as sharply as I had. Brad assured me that with the evidence I had, it was more than possible. The courts would be on my side. When I returned home that evening, I found her waiting for me again, this time in the kitchen. She looked almost fragile, like a leaf on the verge of crumbling. She started to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "We're meeting with the lawyers next week," I said coldly. "Brad will be representing me. I suggest you find someone of your own." Her face fell, and for a brief moment, I saw genuine panic flash in her eyes. "Wait," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, can't we talk about this? Can't we try to fix it?" I shook my head, my voice hard as steel. "You made your choice. Now you're going to live with it." She tried to grab my arm, to plead with me, but I pulled away, unwilling to let her touch me. This wasn't something she could undo with a few tears and empty apologies. This was her reality now, the one she had so callously built for herself. And I wasn't going to let her forget it. In the following days, she tried everything to change my mind. She brought up memories, moments from our past that she thought would soften me. She cried, begged, even tried to seduce me, but I stayed resolute. Every attempt only deepened my resolve, fueling the anger that had become my closest companion. I let her go through the motions, let her believe she still had a chance, but the truth was, I'd already moved on. I was just tying up loose ends. The day of the lawyers' meeting arrived, and I felt a calm I hadn't felt in months. I watched as she entered the office, looking defeated, like a shadow of the woman she once was. Brad greeted us both professionally, barely masking his distaste for her as we settled into our seats. The other lawyer, a younger woman, was stiff and guarded, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room. Brad laid out our terms, and I watched as she listened, her face paling with every word. She tried to negotiate, to salvage something, but Brad shut her down at every turn. The evidence spoke for itself, and she had no ground to stand on. She had lost everything, and there was nothing she could do about it. As we left the meeting, she pulled me aside, her eyes wide and pleading. Is this really what you want? She whispered. To destroy me? I looked her straight in the eye, feeling nothing but satisfaction. You destroyed yourself, I replied. I'm just making sure the world knows it. I walked away, leaving her standing there, alone and broken. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt free. The weight of betrayal had lifted, replaced by a sense of closure that I hadn't thought was possible. She had made her choice, and now I had made mine. In the weeks that followed, I felt an eerie calm settle over me. For the first time in years, I was in control, and I wasn't afraid to wield that power. She was gone now, her things packed and removed from the house. There was no warmth left, no trace of the life we'd built. It was as if she had never been a part of it at all. I liked it that way. I could finally breathe in my own space, untainted by her lies. The court proceedings moved forward smoothly. Brad had warned me that she might try to challenge the terms, but after the way I presented the evidence, she barely put up a fight. She left our home without a cent, her career damaged by whispers and rumors I'd strategically spread. Her so-called project manager had distanced himself, and I relished the irony that he, too, had abandoned her. I wasn't ready to stop there, though. My desire for revenge wasn't just about taking away her material comforts, it was about exposing the truth. She had spent years lying to me, and now it was my turn to tell everyone exactly who she was. In a way, it felt like a civic duty, warning others to steer clear of her manipulations. So, I compiled everything I knew, carefully, methodically, and started sharing it, in subtle ways at first, with close friends and a few key people at her former office. The gossip would spread naturally from there, with no trace of it leading back to me. It wasn't long before I heard rumors trickling back, whispers of the scandal that had ruined her career, hints of her humiliation. People who had once admired her began to keep their distance. The invitations stopped, and friends began to ignore her calls. I wanted her to understand the depth of betrayal, to feel the sting of loneliness, to be seen for who she truly was. And in the quiet moments, I allowed myself to imagine her sitting alone, surrounded by the shattered pieces of the life she'd once taken for granted. But then, something unexpected happened. One day, as I was leaving the office, I ran into an old friend, someone we both knew. He hadn't heard the full story, only the fragments that had circulated. We exchanged pleasantries, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes. After a few minutes of small talk, he leaned in, lowering his voice. So, I heard about everything, he said, an awkward sympathy in his voice. It's tough. Can't imagine going through that. I nodded, appreciating the support but already feeling my guard rise. He didn't need to know every detail, I wasn't about to bare my soul to him. But then he added something that caught me off guard. I get it, he continued, with a hint of a smirk. Sometimes, they just need to be put in their place, right? My ex-wife? She had it coming, too. There was a flicker of satisfaction in his expression, a shared understanding that went beyond simple support. He was telling me, in his own way, that he admired what I'd done, that he respected the lengths I'd gone to. For the first time, I saw the consequences of my actions through someone else's eyes, and it sent a chill down my spine. I'd set out to punish her, to make her suffer for what she'd done, but now I realized I'd become something different, something darker. Revenge had transformed me, and I wasn't sure I liked what I saw. That night, I found myself sitting alone in the house, surrounded by the silence that I'd once craved. The thrill of revenge had begun to fade, leaving a strange emptiness in its place. I tried to shake it off, to remind myself of everything she'd done, but the memories felt distant now, like echoes of a life I'd left behind. She was gone, and yet I was still haunted by her presence, by the choices I'd made in the wake of her betrayal. In a moment of weakness, I picked up my phone, scrolling through old messages, old photos of happier times. There were pictures of vacations, birthdays, and ordinary days that felt perfect simply because we were together. I felt a pang of regret, a flicker of guilt that I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. But I shook it off, dismissing it as nostalgia, nothing more. The next day, I received an email from her. The subject line was blank, but I recognized her email address immediately. I hovered over it, my finger hesitating above the screen. I didn't want to open it. I knew that nothing she could say would change anything, but curiosity got the best of me. With a deep breath, I clicked on it. The message was short, just a few lines, but every word felt like a weight pressing down on me. I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Not just for what I did, but for how I hurt you, for how I ruined what we had. I've lost everything now, and it's because of my own choices. I understand that now. I just needed you to know that. I stared at the screen, reading and rereading her words. There was no plea for forgiveness, no attempt to rebuild what was broken, just an acknowledgement of the damage she'd caused. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete the email and pretend I'd never seen it. But another part of me felt something I hadn't expected, pity. She was truly broken, and for the first time, I realized that my revenge had cost her more than I'd anticipated. As the days passed, I tried to put her out of my mind, to move on with my life as I'd intended from the beginning. But something had shifted. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the destruction I'd left in my wake. Revenge had been sweet, satisfying in ways I hadn't imagined, but it had also left me hollow, a man driven by bitterness and anger. One evening, I sat down with Brad again, sharing a drink after hours. He'd been with me through every step of the process, his legal expertise invaluable, but this time, I wasn't seeking advice. I just needed to talk, to unburden myself in a way I hadn't been able to before. You know, I said, staring into my glass, I thought that once this was over, I'd feel relieved. Free. But it's not that simple, is it? Brad shrugged, giving me a knowing look. Revenge is never simple. It always comes with a price. Sometimes, it's a price we're willing to pay, but other times, it leaves scars we didn't expect. I nodded, understanding his words more than I cared to admit. Revenge had felt empowering, even righteous, but it hadn't brought me the closure I'd been seeking. It had only deepened the wound, leaving a scar that would never fully heal. In the days that followed, I made a decision. I didn't reach out to her, didn't try to reconcile, but I began to let go. I stopped fueling the rumors, stopped digging into her life. I allowed myself to release the anger, to find peace in my own life rather than in her misery. The house grew warmer, the silence softer. I found solace in simple routines, in reconnecting with old friends, in rediscovering who I was without the shadow of betrayal looming over me. Slowly, I began to heal, to rebuild a life that was mine alone. And as time passed, the memories faded. The anger, the bitterness, they became distant echoes, reminders of a man I'd once been but had left behind. I was free now, in the truest sense, not because I had taken revenge, but because I had let go. Months had passed, and the scars of betrayal and revenge had faded to a dull ache, one that was manageable, if not completely forgotten. I had moved on, or so I thought. The house was mine, unburdened by her presence or the ghosts of what we once shared. I had returned to my routines, building a life that felt new and clean. In moments of clarity, I even found myself feeling almost grateful to be free of her, of the lies and deceit that had tainted our life together. But deep down, something lingered, a shadow I couldn't shake. It was on an unremarkable autumn evening that I heard from her again. I had returned home from work, weary and ready to collapse onto the couch, when I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was a letter from her, delivered by hand, judging by the unmarked envelope. My heart pounded as I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of what this could mean. Part of me wanted to rip it up, to refuse her even the simplest acknowledgement, but a curiosity, a morbid pull, drew me to open it. Inside, the letter was handwritten, each line carefully crafted. Her words were shaky, as though she'd written them through trembling hands. Dear, my name. I know you didn't expect to hear from me again, and perhaps you never wanted to. I can't blame you for that. I write this knowing that I have no right to ask for your attention, for even a moment of your time. I know you're done with me. But please, just read this through. It won't take long. Since you last saw me, I've tried to rebuild, to find some kind of life in the aftermath of what I did to us. I have searched for meaning, for anything that might fill the void I left in both our lives. But it's no use. I'm haunted by what I've done, by how I betrayed you, and in many ways, betrayed myself. I lost the best parts of me, and I see now that I threw away the one person who saw me fully, who knew me for everything I was, flaws and all. I know words won't heal the damage I caused, and they won't undo the pain. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. But there is one thing I need to say before I lose the courage to write this. I have never stopped loving you. Through every mistake, every regret, my heart never forgot what we shared, even if I was too blind to see it at the time. I understand if you want nothing to do with me. I understand if you throw this letter away. But know that I am sorry, not for the consequences I've faced, but for breaking you, for breaking us. I have to live with that, and it's a weight I carry every day. I wish you peace, happiness, and love, even if it is not with me. Goodbye. Her name was scrawled at the bottom, barely legible, as if the weight of her own words had drained her. I held the letter, my fingers clenching the paper until it crumpled. I should have felt victorious, I'd won, after all. She was ruined, empty, just as I had intended. But as I reread her words, a heaviness settled over me, pressing down with a weight I hadn't expected. The anger that had once filled me had burned out, leaving behind only an emptiness that echoed through the silence of the house. That night, I lay awake, her words looping through my mind. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself it was too late, that her regrets couldn't change the past. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with every passing hour. Her remorse had stirred something inside me, a memory of what we'd shared before it all went wrong. I tried to push it away, to hold on to my hardened resolve, but it was no use. The next morning, I made a decision. Against every logical part of me, I drove to her old apartment. I told myself it was closure, one last chance to confront her, to see for myself that she was nothing more than a painful chapter I'd finally left behind. But as I stood outside her door, my hands shaking, I felt something more, a need to understand, to see if any part of the woman I had loved still remained. When I knocked, there was no answer. I waited, then knocked again, a cold unease creeping up my spine. I could feel that something was wrong. I called her name, pressing my ear to the door. Still nothing. Finally, with a dread I couldn't explain, I went down to the apartment manager and explained that I was concerned for her safety. The manager hesitated, but something in my expression must have convinced him. He retrieved a spare key, and together we opened the door. The room was dark, the blinds drawn, casting shadows over the empty space. I stepped inside, my heart pounding as I scanned the room. And then I saw her, curled up on the couch, her face pale and still. The manager gasped, but I barely registered it. I rushed to her side, calling her name, shaking her gently. But there was no response. She lay there, a fragile shell, her face etched with a sadness I hadn't seen before. On the table beside her was a half-empty bottle of pills, a crumpled piece of paper beneath it. With trembling hands, I picked up the note. Her handwriting was rushed, hurried, as if she'd struggled to get the words out before her courage failed. I'm sorry. I thought I could live with it, but I can't. I can't bear the thought of hurting you, of living with the knowledge of what I've done. You were my everything, and I destroyed it. I destroyed us. Maybe, in another life, we could have been happy again. I wish I could turn back time, but it's too late. I'm so sorry. Please, remember me for who I was before I lost my way. I sank to the floor, the letter clutched in my hands, my mind reeling. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. I had wanted revenge, had yearned to see her suffer for what she'd done, but not like this. Not this empty, hollow finality. The reality of it crashed over me, leaving me gasping, choking on a grief I hadn't known was there. In my quest to make her pay, I'd forgotten the love we once shared, the bond that had held us together through the years. I'd wanted her to feel my pain, but I hadn't considered what it would cost her, what it would cost us both. I had torn her apart, but in the process, I'd destroyed a part of myself as well. The days that followed were a blur. I moved through them in a daze, haunted by memories of her laugh, her smile, the life we'd once dreamed of together. People offered their condolences, their sympathy, but none of it reached me. They didn't understand the depth of what had been lost, the hollow ache that echoed through every empty room in the house we'd shared. Late at night, when the silence became unbearable, I found myself reaching for her letters, for the words she'd left behind. I read them over and over, hoping for some form of solace, but all I found was a bitter reminder of the love I had destroyed. In the end, my revenge had taken everything, leaving me alone with nothing but memories and regrets. And as the years passed, I remained haunted by the what-ifs, by the paths we hadn't taken, by the life we could have shared. She was gone, and so was the man I'd once been, buried beneath the weight of a vengeance that had cost me everything.